So now that we got the Hello World connector out of the way, we're going to build our first actual data call API. And that's going to be the unsecured API call that we talked about. So the unsecured API call is basically just doing a data call without any request key in there. We've already looked at the documentation, but I'm just going to open it one more time. So we're going to be using API no auth, where you can simply pass in this hyperlink and you're going to get the data. The only issue is that this endpoint returns 5 data points, but we have more than that. So you would have to paginate. So you do localhost /boys/page equals to 0 for the first page, then page equals to 1 for the second page, and so on. So a bit of context, I've coded this such that there are 15 data points. So we would need to paginate three times or iterate 3 times through the paginations. However, the code that we're about to write will work for n number of pages. So hypothetically, if we had 500 data points, then the system would paginate 100 times. On the 101th iteration, it would realize, hey, there's no data, and it would pretty much stop there. So that's the function that we're going to create to get through the pagination first. So again, this API that I'm about to use is not publicly available. It has to be used locally. So if you have fast API installed, you can follow along with me for this part. Otherwise, you can just skip this part. So to get your API running, you should have API no auth pasted on your user directory. So if I go C drive, users, and my name, I have these 2 Python files here, API and API no auth. You want to open up command prompt. So you can either do that by just doing CMD and opening up command prompt, or you could do what I do. You can open it up within Visual Studio Code. So you can go into terminal. You can go plus here and split terminal and then add a command prompt session from within Visual Studio Code. So here I have my command prompt open on my terminal. So first of all, I would need to change the directory to C users Imran. That's where my Python files are located. So I do cd or change directory and then navigate over to my file directory. So I'm at the directory where my Python files are. So I can launch my API no auth application. So what I'd have to do is I have to type uvicorn API no auth. App, and then I do 2 dashes host 0000. This basically means it's going to be hosted locally, and then it has to be hosted on a port. So I'm going to use port 80. If you do not have port 80 open, you can choose another port to do it. But if I'm going to do port 80 and then hit enter. And then it says my Uvicorn is running. So my API is up right now. So we can open up Postman and test whether this API is working or not. So I have my get call here. And if I hit send, here are my first 5 boys names. And then I can simply add query parameters. And if I do page equals to 0, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the first 5. Page equals to 1, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Page equals to 2. The next 5, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. And page equals to 3 is when it should fail because I have no more data at that point. So there we go. We do not have any more data at this point. So we know that the API is working, so we can start experimenting in Power BI. So I'm going to go into Power BI and I'm going to just start off with the web source. URL will be HTTP localhost port 80 and boys. All right, so I got my first 5 entries. Now is the pagination part of it. So let's go there. So you want to go into Advanced Editor, come up here, and so before we do this, let me just show you real quick how we should paginate. So right now it's showing me the first 5. If I were to do, this is page equals to 0. If I were to do page equals to 1, it should show me 6 to 10. And then if I do page equals to 2, it should show me 11 to 15. So essentially what I want to do is I have this number here and I want to loop through 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on until I'm out of data. In this scenario, it's going to be 0, 1, 2, and then it's going to stop at 3 because 3 has no data. So let's write that function. Right, so the way I'm going to start this is, first of all, I'm going to declare a function. I'm going to call that offset loop. And in this function, I'm going to pass a parameter. I'm going to pass the parameter page. And this parameter is going to be a number. And I'm going to add a comma here and a let statement at the top. So what does that mean exactly? So this chunk of code here before the comma and after the offset loop, this entire chunk of code is part of this function, meaning that when I'm saying I want to do offset loop, I'm essentially saying that I want to execute this piece of mQuery. Now, the parameter that I'm passing through page. So this page is going to be a number, and what I want to do is I want to start off with page equals to 0 and keep increasing the page for every time I'm executing this function up until the point that I don't have any more data. So first start with page equals to 0, execute offset loop. That's going to give me the first page. Then, does page 1 have data? Yes. Execute offset loop with page equals to 1 to get the second page. Does the next page have data? Yes. Execute offset loop with page equals to 2. Does the next page have data? No. Finish the offset loop function at that point. That's essentially what I want to code in right now. So I'm going to generate a list. And this is my list generate function. No parameters passed through here. So I'm going to declare a result, which is try the offset loop function where page equals to 0. So I'm passing the parameter number as 0 for the first try. If it's null, then end at page equals to 0. If it's not null, then so if result, which is the output of offset loop, is not null, then I want to take result and I wanted to try offset loop page plus 1. So what's essentially happening here is if offset loop 0 or page equals to 0 is null, then end at page equals to 0. Otherwise, try page equals to 0 plus 1 and declare page is equals to page plus 1. So on the next iteration, it's going to try page equals to 1 and then page equals to 2 and so on. And then each result. And this is basically saying that for every iteration of result, you want to concatenate them together. And that's basically my function. I'm going to get rid of this bracket here as I already closed the parentheses here. And I'm going to end my source call here. So in source. Okay. Oh, so now that I have this function declared here, I want to make sure that the page for each iteration, whatever the page number is, I want to apply it here. So to do that, what I have to do is have parentheses here and two ands. And within these parameters, I want to type in the dynamic page number. So I do number dot to text page. And essentially what's happening here is the page that I'm generating here, I want to convert that number into text because the hyperlink is a text. So I'm taking this page variable here, which is being looped through on this function. And whatever iteration of page number we're at, it's going to apply it to the offset loop function. So if I hit done, there we go. I can see that it tried 3 times. And then I can transform this to table. Okay. Expand it. And there we go. We have paginated and we got all the data from our API. So that's the pagination part of it. All right, so building off this, I'd like to build this in my SDK as well. So if I go back to my SDK, so I would open up the documentation first. And in the Power Query documentation, you want to go into trip and walkthrough and go into REST API. If I scroll down here, it says creating a basic REST connector. And these are the two code samples that it gave us to work with. So first of all, I'm going to take this default request headers and I'm going to paste that in my code file. So I'm just going to say required default headers as per documentation. So I know that why this thing is in my document. And sorry, this let function over here, I'm just going to copy this. So I'm just going to keep in the let function. In the documentation, they pass URL as text. We're not going to worry about that for now, but I'll show you how you can pass URL as text in a bit. So I'm just going to delete that, and I'm going to manually type in the URL here. So HTTP localhost port 80 voice. And then I'm going to build this connector. So I've just did Control Shift B and enter to do that. And then set credential and press enter 3 times. 1, 2, 3. A new anonymous credential has been successfully generated, and then I'll hit evaluate current file. So now I'm getting my 5 records, and in Power Query you would get those 5 records, and then you would do expand to table and then expand the records. So let's do this in a way where you would pass a parameter. So if I do URL as text, I can basically say that I want to, whatever we're defining as URL, that would be the URL that we want to use. So again, for my testing purposes, I'm going to mention my URL here. And then I'm going to build this. set my credential, and hit evaluate current file. So I have my 5 records here. So what was the point of actually creating a variable instead of just typing in the URL, say, let me just open this. So again, what was the reason for putting URL as a parameter and including it here rather than just having the URL? They both did the same thing essentially. So what you noticed me do is you noticed that I explicitly mentioned the URL here. And in your Power BI environment, you can manually specify the URL. So if your URL is something that you want to keep dynamic, in that scenario, you want to use it as a parameter. And I'll show you in practice what I mean by that. So I just built this connector. So if I go to connector tutorial, and I take the mess file that I just built, and I paste this in, one sec. I'll go to Documents, Power BI, Custom Connectors, and replace the mess file that I have here with my new mess file. I'm going to cancel this. I'm going to create a new query. I'm going to use the new connector file that I just built. So now you see here, it's asking me what the URL is. Because I declared the URL as a parameter, it's asking me to input it in. So if I were to input this in, it will essentially give me the records that I need to get. Similarly, I can change this URL to do girls. And I can get the list of girls as well. So this is more useful when it comes to putting in request keys or doing authentications where you want the variable to be dynamic. So moving on, now we need to figure out the pagination bit. So how do we do that? So we already built our pagination here. So what we can do is we can just take all this code here. And we can replace our let function here with the code that we have on our mQuery. And you want to put a semicolon here to tell them that, to tell the SDK that your let function is finishing up here. And finally, you can keep the URL as static, or you could say that you want URL and page equals to, and then whatever the value for page is. So let's build this. Set my credential. Enter, enter, enter. And finally, evaluate the current file. And there we go. We have the list of all 15 boys' names. Similarly, what I can do is I can mention my hyperlink to be with girls, build, set credential, enter, 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 and evaluate current file. And I get all my girls' names as well. So the next step that we want to do is we want to build a navigation table where I can pick between boys or girls. So that's what we're going to do shortly.